The afternoon sun spilled through the narrow windows of the prison dining hall, turning the dull walls a faint shade of gold. The air smelled of reheated food and cleaning liquid, the usual mix that filled the place every day. It was lunchtime and rows of men stood in line waiting for their trays. For most, it was a routine they had learned to live with. Nothing really changed in there. Same food, same faces, same tired conversations. At one corner of the hall, two men walked in almost at the same time. They didn't know each other well, but they had seen each other often enough to nod in passing. Both carried the kind of quiet that comes from being inside for too long. They picked up their trays, got their food, and looked for a place to sit. That was when something so small happened it almost didn't make sense later on. One of them pulled out a chair at the same table the other was about to sit at. Neither wanted to move. The moment hung in the air like a spark waiting for a breeze. "What's your problem?" one said, his voice sharp but calm. "No problem," the other replied, setting his tray down. "You can sit somewhere else. It could have ended there. Maybe it should have. But inside those walls, where pride was often the only thing a man could hold on to, even simple words could feel like a challenge." A few nearby inmates stopped chewing, watching quietly. The guards noticed too, their hands already resting on their belts, waiting to see what would happen. "I was here first," the first man said again, his tone a little louder now. His eyes were firm, not angry, but not backing down either. "Doesn't look like it," the other replied. "You just think everything's yours." Voices started to rise, the quiet hall turning tense. The scrape of chairs echoed as people shifted away from the table. It wasn't a fight yet, but it was close enough to make everyone nervous. The guard stepped forward, but they didn't need to grab anyone. The warden had trained them well. "Watch, don't jump in too soon unless it turns physical." Finally, one guard raised his voice. "That's enough. Both of you step back." The two men glared at each other, their breathing heavy. One finally picked up his tray and moved to another table. The other sat down, though his hands were still shaking slightly, more from frustration than fear. Around them, the noise slowly returned. The clatter of trays, low talk, the sound of spoons hitting plastic plates. But something had changed. The room wasn't the same anymore. The tension stayed like smoke after a fire. Later that day, whispers spread through the cell blocks. Some said one man had been disrespectful. Others said the opposite. In a place where stories twisted with every retelling, truth didn't matter as much as loyalty. Within hours, small groups were already arguing over what had really happened. Some said it wasn't about the chair at all. It was about who was right. And that was enough to keep the talk going. That evening, one of the older inmates in the common area shook his head and muttered, "All this over a seat? People out there fight for freedom. In here we fight for chairs." Another man laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was tired, like someone who'd seen this kind of thing too many times. "Yeah, that's how it starts. Always small. The next thing you know, everyone's picking sides." As night fell, the guards made their rounds, locking cell doors one by one. In the quiet, the sound of low voices carried through the block. Some talked about what had happened that day. Others just complained about how everyone was making a big deal out of nothing. But in the minds of a few, the argument wasn't over. It had just moved into silence, waiting for another spark. The next morning, both men went about their routines as if nothing had happened. But in a place where everyone noticed everything, they couldn't escape the attention. When one passed the other in the hallway, people watched. A few nodded at one, others at the other. It was strange how something so meaningless had created invisible lines through the prison. During lunch the following day, the guards noticed fewer people talking. There was an odd kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't come from peace but from waiting. The warden, who had been there long enough to understand how small things could grow fast, watched from the corner of the room. He didn't interfere. He knew that forcing peace never worked. Sometimes you had to let things play out to see where the real problem was. One of the kitchen workers, an older man with years of quiet observation behind him, leaned over to a younger inmate and whispered, "You see this? Pride, that's all it is. It's the one thing that never gets locked up." The young inmate frowned. "But it was just a chair." "Nothing's ever just what it looks like," the old man replied. "In here, people don't argue about chairs or food or turns. They argue about respect, and respect's the only thing that keeps some men standing." That night, one of the guards made a note in his report, "Minor disagreement in dining hall. No violence. Atmosphere tense but stable." He didn't think much of it. He'd seen worse. But what no one realized was that the small event had already started something deeper. Conversations that night stretched longer than usual. Men began to talk about how easy it was to lose your temper in a place where you already had nothing left to prove. Some admitted they saw themselves in that moment, ready to argue, to defend, to not back down even when it didn't matter. Inside his office, the warden looked over the day's reports. He had heard about the argument, of course. It seemed small, not worth calling either man in. But what caught his attention was the mood change in the cafeteria. It wasn't the argument itself that concerned him. It was the way it echoed afterward. He leaned back in his chair and thought quietly, remembering his own words from a training years ago. In a place without freedom, pride becomes a man's last defense. He understood it well, maybe too well. By the end of the week, the story had already grown. Some said the argument had almost turned into a fight. Others claimed one man had insulted the other on purpose. Everyone had their own version, and each one made the story a little bigger, a little louder. It wasn't about truth anymore. It was about belonging to a side. That was how things often worked inside. People didn't want to be right. They wanted to belong. One evening, as the sun set behind the prison walls, the man who had first spoken in the argument sat alone in the yard. The orange light hit the wire fence, throwing long shadows across the ground. He stared at them, not really thinking, just letting his mind wander. After a while, another man came over and sat beside him quietly. They didn't talk at first. The silence felt easier than words. Finally, the other man said, "You know, people still talking about that chair thing." The first man sighed. "Yeah, I heard. Crazy how small things turn big in here." He nodded. "Guess that's what happens when there's nothing else to talk about." "Maybe," the other man said. "Or maybe it's something else. Maybe everyone's just tired of holding everything in. That argument just gave them something to let out." The first man didn't reply, but he knew the truth in those words. It wasn't really about him or the other guy. It was about the pressure that built up when people lived side by side, day after day, with no escape and too much pride. Somewhere deep down, a small part of him wished he could take it back, not because he feared punishment, but because he could feel how the air had changed. It wasn't worth it. But it was too late. The story had already left his hands. That night, the prison fell quiet again, but not peacefully. The silence felt heavy, like everyone was waiting for something more to happen. None of them knew that this tiny, forgettable moment, a chair, a few sharp words, and a crowd of restless eyes, was about to turn into a lesson that would reach every corner of that prison. A lesson that no one saw coming. The next few days inside the prison felt different. The small argument that started in the dining hall seemed to hang in the air like dust that wouldn't settle. People talked about it in whispers, but everyone knew. It became the new topic of every conversation, from the kitchen line to the workout yard. No one could quite explain why it mattered so much, but somehow, it did. It started with a few comments here and there. Someone saying one man had disrespected the other. Another saying it was blown out of proportion. Soon sides began to form. Not official ones, not anything violent, just quiet alliances. One group would sit on one side of the dining hall, the other on the opposite. It was subtle but clear enough that even the guards noticed. Inside a place where boredom ruled every day, even the smallest thing could grow into something big. And this argument, meaningless as it seemed, gave everyone something to feel involved in. For some, it was about defending what they thought was right. For others, it was about not appearing weak. Pride ran deep in a place where respect was often all a man had left. The warden could sense the shift. He was an older man who had worked in corrections for decades. He'd seen big problems start from tiny sparks, and he didn't like the way this one was spreading. He told the guards to keep watch but not to interfere yet. "Let's see where this goes," he said quietly. "Sometimes you have to let the fire show itself before you can put it out." By midweek, the cafeteria had become a place of silent tension. No one argued out loud, but the energy was heavy. When the two men who started the argument came in, eyes followed them everywhere. They didn't speak to each other, but the distance between them said enough. One of them had begun spending time alone. He didn't enjoy the attention. The other, though quieter, seemed to have people gathering around him, mostly to ask questions about what really happened. He kept repeating the same thing. It wasn't a big deal, but the more he said it, the less anyone believed him. Inside those walls, stories often grew legs of their own. That night, two inmates were talking in their cell. The older one said, "You ever notice how fast things change in here? Yesterday, nobody cared who sat where. Now everyone's watching like it's a game." The younger one nodded. "Guess people just need something to talk about." "Yeah," the older one replied. "But talk can turn into something else. Words get heavy in here." Meanwhile, the warden decided to quietly call in the guards for a short meeting. They sat in his small office while he leaned back in his chair, eyes thoughtful. "I don't want this to grow into something stupid," he said. "Keep the peace, but don't push anyone. Let's see who's really stirring it up." The guards nodded, understanding what he meant. It wasn't about punishment, it was about observation. That same day, something interesting began to happen. During the afternoon recreation period, a few men began talking about what the argument meant. One said it was about respect. Another said it was about ego. A third said it was just about being bored. But the conversation didn't end there. It spread to the others sitting nearby, and soon a group of 10 men were talking about what it meant to live in a place where pride mattered more than peace. For the first time in a while, it wasn't just gossip. It was reflection, though no one would have called it that. They were just men talking, trying to make sense of a small moment that somehow felt bigger than it should have been. A few days later, during breakfast, one of the kitchen workers, a quiet man who everyone respected, spoke up while serving food. "You know," he said softly to one of the younger inmates, "sometimes we fight because we forget who we're fighting." The young man frowned. "What do you mean?" The kitchen worker smiled slightly. "We fight each other when really, we're just angry at being stuck here." The young man didn't answer, but he thought about those words long after he sat down to eat. The mood inside the prison kept shifting. There were no fights, but there was a strange sense of waiting, like something was about to happen. The warden, still observing, decided to speak to both men who had argued that day. He didn't call them in together yet. He wanted to see how they were handling things separately. When the first man came in, he looked tired. The warden asked him, "Do you know what's happening out there?" The man nodded. "Yeah. People are talking like I started something big." "Did you?" the warden asked calmly. "No," the man said. "It was just about a chair." The warden leaned forward slightly. "It's not about the chair anymore, is it?" The man didn't reply. He looked down, shaking his head. The warden didn't push further. He dismissed him with a short nod, then called for the other man a few hours later. The second one walked in with a firmer posture, though his voice was quiet. The warden asked him the same question. "Do you know what's happening out there?" He hesitated. "Yeah, people keep asking me to explain. I told them to drop it, but they don't listen." "You've been here long enough," the warden said. "You know how fast things grow when people have nothing to do." The man nodded. "Yeah, but I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know," the warden said. "But it's happening anyway." That night, the warden sat alone in his office for a long time. He had an idea forming in his mind, something different from the usual way of handling things. He didn't believe in harsh punishment for small mistakes. He believed in lessons, the kind that stuck. He decided he'd wait a bit longer before stepping in, but when he did, it wouldn't be with anger. It would be with purpose. Over the next few days, something unexpected began to occur. Some inmates who had never spoken much started having small conversations about anger, about patience, about pride. It wasn't organized. It just happened naturally. Maybe the argument had reminded them of how easy it was to lose control, and how quickly one moment could change everything. One evening, while a few men sat together in the recreation area, a man who rarely spoke said quietly, "Maybe that argument wasn't about the chair. Maybe it was about how close we all are to snapping." The others looked at him in surprise. He wasn't the type to talk much. "You mean everyone?" one asked. He nodded. "Yeah, everyone. We all walk around carrying something heavy. Sometimes it only takes one wrong word to let it out." There was a silence after that. It wasn't awkward. It was understanding. Meanwhile, the two men who had started it all were beginning to think about what had happened too. They hadn't spoken since that day, but each could feel the weight of the situation. One of them found himself staring at the same seat in the dining hall, thinking about how fast everything had changed because of a single moment of pride. The other, sitting across the room, caught his eye once, then quickly looked away. It was clear that both of them had started to regret it, not because they feared punishment, but because they saw how something so small had affected so many. By the end of the week, the tension began to fade slightly. People were still divided, but the anger was cooling down. The warden noticed it too. He decided the time was near to bring everyone together, to talk, to listen, and to make sense of what had happened. But for now, he let the quiet settle. Sometimes silence taught better than shouting ever could. That night, as the lights dimmed and the prison grew still, both men lay in their bunks wide awake, thinking the same thought. How strange it was that something so simple could grow so big. Neither knew it yet, but the warden's next move would change everything. What started as a small argument was slowly turning into a lesson that would reach every corner of the prison, touching people who hadn't even been near that table that day. Days passed quietly, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that carried weight, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. The argument that had started over a chair had cooled down on the surface, yet deep inside the prison walls, it had left an impression. The warden, who had been watching everything from a distance, finally decided it was time to step in, but not with punishment. He had a different idea in mind. One morning, the guards called both men to the warden's office. Neither knew why. They hadn't spoken since that day in the dining hall, and the walk down the corridor felt long. The guards didn't say a word, only led them through the echoing hallway. The clinking of keys, the soft squeak of boots, and the hum of the old fluorescent lights filled the air. When they entered the office, the warden didn't shout or glare. He just looked at them quietly, as if studying something deeper than their faces. On his desk were 2 files and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The room smelled faintly of paper and old wood. "Sit down," he said simply. They obeyed, each taking a chair opposite his desk. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched until the warden leaned forward slightly and said, "Do either of you remember what started that argument?" The 2 men glanced at each other for the first time in days. One frowned, trying to think, while the other just shook his head slowly. "I think it was about a seat," one said after a moment. The warden nodded. "A seat, that's right. You both argued over a chair in a room full of them. But now half this place is talking about it like it was something bigger." The men stayed quiet. The warden wasn't angry, but his calm tone made the words hit harder. "Tell me," he continued, what did that argument give you? Did it make you feel stronger? Did it give you respect?" Neither answered. They didn't need to. The truth was already written on their faces. The warden sighed softly. "You see, in here, pride can feel like the only thing a man owns. But sometimes holding on to pride too tightly takes away more than it gives. You both lost something that day, and so did everyone watching." He stood up and walked to the window. From there he could see the prison yard, a wide gray stretch of concrete surrounded by fences and watchtowers. "You know," he said, "I've worked in places like this most of my life. I've seen men fight for a lot of reasons. But what I've learned is it's not the big fights that ruin peace, it's the small ones that people refuse to let go of." He turned back to them, eyes steady. "I'm not here to punish you. I want you to do something else. Tomorrow I want you both to sit in the same room again. Not to argue, not to defend yourselves. I want you to talk. I'll bring a few others too. We're going to have a conversation, something we should have started a long time ago." The 2 men looked unsure. Talking openly in front of others didn't sound appealing, especially in a place where vulnerability was often mistaken for weakness. But they didn't have a choice. The warden dismissed them, and as they walked out, both carried the same uneasy thought. What exactly did he mean by a conversation? The next day, the guards escorted them to the common hall. A few chairs were set up in a circle. There were other inmates there too. One's known for keeping peace, along with a few who had been in trouble before. The warden stood near the back, hands behind his back, letting the prison chaplain lead the gathering. The room was quiet at first. The 2 men sat across from each other, avoiding eye contact. The chaplain spoke gently, introducing the purpose of the meeting. "We're not here to point fingers," he said. "We're here to talk about what happens when anger takes over, when pride takes control, and what it costs all of us." For a while, no one said anything. Then one of the older inmates spoke up. "It's easy to lose your temper in here," he said slowly. "Every day feels the same. You see the same faces, hear the same noises. Sometimes it doesn't take much to make you explode." Heads nodded around the circle. Everyone understood. The chaplain turned to one of the men from the argument. "Tell us what you felt that day." He hesitated, eyes fixed on the floor. "I felt disrespected," he said finally. "I thought he was trying to push me around. I didn't want to look weak." The chaplain nodded. "And you?" he asked the other man. The second man took a deep breath. "I just wanted to sit down. I didn't mean anything by it, but when he got loud, I got louder. I didn't want to back down either." A soft murmur went through the group. It was the same story they had all lived in one way or another. Two people trapped by pride, reacting instead of understanding. The warden, still silent at the back, watched the room closely. He could see the shift happening. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. For the first time, men who had spent years hiding behind toughness were sitting in a circle, speaking honestly. The conversation went on for an hour. Some shared moments when they'd let anger control them. Others talked about how they wished they'd handled things differently in the past. It wasn't perfect. Some stayed quiet. Others laughed off their pain. But it was a start. When it ended, the warden stepped forward. "What you just did," he said, "takes more strength than any fight. You didn't yell, you didn't hide. You talked. And maybe that's what we've been missing here. A place to let things out before they turn into something worse." He paused, then added softly, "You might think this doesn't change much, but it does. The way you handled the small things says a lot about who you are when the big things come." The group was dismissed, but as the men left, something in the air had shifted. It was lighter, calmer. The two who had argued didn't speak right away, but when their paths crossed at dinner later that evening, one gave a small nod. The other nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. That night, in the quiet of the cell block, some men talked about the meeting. A few mocked it at first, saying it was just another warden trick. But most, deep down, felt something different. The conversation had made them think about their tempers, about how quick they were to defend themselves, and about how tired they were of all the unspoken tension that filled the air. The following days were calmer. Fewer arguments, fewer glares. It wasn't peace, not fully, but it was better. The warden noticed the change too. He began encouraging more small group talks, led by the chaplain and a few volunteers. They didn't call it therapy or correction. They called it circle time. And somehow that made it easier for people to join in. The two men who started it all attended more than one session. Each time they spoke a little more honestly. One day, the first man said quietly, "I realized I wasn't really mad at him. I was mad at myself for letting this place get to me." The room fell silent. No one expected him to say something like that, but it struck a chord with everyone there. By the end of that week, something small but powerful was happening inside those gray walls. The argument that had once divided everyone had become the reason people were finally talking. The warden didn't make a big announcement about it. He didn't need to. He just watched it grow naturally, one quiet conversation at a time. At night, when he walked through the halls, he saw things he hadn't seen in a long time. Men sitting together, laughing softly, helping each other clean up after meals. There was still frustration, of course, still boredom and restlessness. But there was also a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. It amazed him that it all started with something as small as a chair. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest spark doesn't destroy, it teaches. And that's exactly what was beginning to happen. A small argument had opened a door that had been locked for far too long. Weeks passed, and the prison began to feel different. It wasn't something that happened all at once, but slowly, like the first light after a long night. The air felt calmer. The noise that usually filled the hallways, the arguments, the shouts, the slamming of doors, seemed to fade. The warden noticed it first during his morning walk. The guards noticed it too. There was still tension, yes, but it wasn't the kind that boiled over anymore. It was quieter, more thoughtful. Something inside the walls had changed. The warden's idea had worked better than he expected. What started as a small meeting had turned into something much bigger. The inmates had begun holding their own small talks, Nothing official, just groups sitting together talking about life, about choices, about control. They didn't call it therapy or counseling, they just called it talk time. And somehow that made all the difference. At first, only a few joined in, but when others saw how calm those talks made people feel, more started showing up. Some listened quietly from a distance before finally taking a seat. The men who had once avoided eye contact were now nodding to each other, sharing their thoughts. It was strange but good. One afternoon, during a break in the yard, a small group sat under the shadow of the high fence. The sun was hot, but they didn't mind. One of the men said softly, "You know what I realized? We're all fighting something inside us, not each other." Another nodded. "Yeah, we just take it out on whoever's closest." They didn't have the words for it, but they were talking about accountability, about emotional control, things no one had ever taught them before. In that moment, for the first time in years, some of them felt truly understood. The two men whose argument had started it all were also there. They didn't sit together, but they didn't avoid each other anymore either. Over time, they had learned to nod in passing, to exchange small gestures of peace. The warden had noticed. He saw that neither man was the same as before. The spark that had once caused chaos had now turned into something unexpectedly healing. Inside the dining hall, where the argument first began, there was a new sense of respect. People moved aside for each other without muttering. Fewer trays were dropped, fewer insults thrown. It was still prison, nothing perfect about it, but the mood had shifted in a way that even the guards found surprising. One guard told another, during lunch duty, "I don't know what the warden did, but whatever it is, it's working." The other guard nodded. "Yeah, it's quieter now. People actually listen." In the evenings, the chaplain and a few trusted inmates started organizing group discussions in the common room. They would sit in a circle, no one standing higher than the rest. Sometimes they shared memories from the outside world, sometimes lessons from inside. One evening, the chaplain asked everyone, "What do you think respect really means in here?" There was silence at first. Then one man spoke. "It means not trying to make someone feel smaller just to feel bigger yourself." Another said, "It means keeping peace even when you could win a fight." Heads nodded around the room. The words were simple, but they carried truth. One of the men who had been part of the original argument spoke up too. His voice was quiet, but clear. "Back then I thought standing my ground made me strong, but I see now it just made me stubborn. Real strength's knowing when to stop." The others listened closely. His words carried weight because everyone remembered what had happened. The very fact that he could admit it showed how much had changed. As the weeks went on, these talks began to spread from one block to another. Some men started writing short reflections on pieces of paper, leaving them on the table for others to read. One note said, "We live where mistakes brought us, but we can still choose what kind of men we want to be tomorrow." That simple message got passed around quietly. Even the guards saw it and smiled. The warden decided to make the meetings a regular part of the schedule, but he didn't want to make them feel forced. "Keep it optional," he told his staff. "Change has to come from choice, not command." And he was right. The inmates attended because they wanted to, not because they were told to. That was what made it work. During one of those sessions, something unexpected happened. A younger inmate, who had always been quick to anger, broke down while speaking. He admitted that he never knew how to handle his emotions, and that every argument he ever got into made him feel powerful for a moment, then empty after. He said, "I thought being tough meant not feeling anything, but I'm tired of pretending." The room went silent. No one laughed, no one judged. Instead, an older man put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're learning something most men never do. You're growing." Moments like that became more common. Men who had once been bitter and cold started showing sides of themselves they had hidden for years. It wasn't easy. Some still struggled, some still refused to talk, but even they couldn't ignore the shift happening around them. One day, during the warden's inspection, he stopped by one of the meetings. He stood quietly at the back, listening as the men shared their thoughts. He didn't say a word, but when he left, He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Later that night, he wrote in his journal, "Sometimes peace doesn't come from control. It comes from understanding, and understanding can come from the most unlikely places." The next morning, he shared a simple message on the prison notice board. It read, "A man who learns from his anger is stronger than a man who wins a fight." No one knew who wrote it, but everyone knew whose handwriting it was. The quote became something of a quiet motto around the prison. People started repeating it during meals, in line, even during yard time. The change didn't go unnoticed outside the walls. Visitors and new staff members often commented on how the place felt different, calmer, more respectful. One new guard said, "It feels strange. It's still prison, but it's like people care more now." The warden knew the change was fragile. It needed care. He continued to encourage discussions, giving the inmates a sense of responsibility for maintaining peace. The two men who had once argued were now helping the chaplain organize these circles. They never bragged about it, never took credit, but others looked up to them. People began to see them not as rivals, but as examples of what growth looked like. One afternoon, while the warden was walking through the yard, he overheard a conversation between two men. One was complaining about another inmate taking his seat at lunch. The other smiled and said, "Let it go, man. You don't want another chair story." They both laughed. The warden kept walking, but smiled to himself. That small moment told him more than any report ever could. The lesson had spread. Inside a place built on control, a little understanding had managed to grow. It didn't erase the past. It didn't make the walls any lower or the time any shorter, but it made living inside those walls a little easier. It made the air a little lighter. That night, as the lights dimmed and the sounds of footsteps faded, the two men who had started everything found themselves sitting across from each other in the dining hall again. This time there was no tension, no pride. One of them smiled faintly and said, "You taking this seat?" The other smiled back, "Go ahead, it's all yours." They both laughed quietly, and for the first time it didn't feel forced. Around them, the hall was filled with small conversations and laughter, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be heard. The warden walked past and stopped for a moment to watch. It was just another night, but to him, it felt like something rare. Change had happened, not through punishment or power, but through people learning to see each other differently. In that moment, it was clear that what began as a simple argument had turned into something much larger, a reminder that even in the hardest places, kindness and understanding can find a way to survive. Months had passed since the argument that once shook the prison. The seasons had changed, and so had the people living inside those tall gray walls. What used to be a place full of noise, anger, and tension had now turned into something unexpected, a place of quiet learning, respect, and small steps toward hope. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but there was something different in the air, something that no one had thought possible before. The warden stood by his office window one early morning, looking out at the yard. The men were walking in groups, talking calmly. Some played chess on makeshift boards. Others read books or exercised in silence. There were still guards watching, still fences standing tall, but the feeling was softer somehow. The warden took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "It's working." He wasn't proud in a loud way, but in a quiet, grateful way. He knew this peace was fragile. It could be broken by one wrong moment, one careless word, but it had lasted longer than anyone expected, and that meant something. He picked up his notebook, the one he had started writing in after the first meeting, and began jotting down thoughts. "Growth isn't loud," he wrote. "It happens in silence, when people finally start listening to each other." Meanwhile, down in the dining hall, the two men who had once argued over a seat now sat across from each other again, but this time they were sharing stories, not anger. They didn't become best friends overnight, but they had found a strange kind of respect. One of them was telling a story about his childhood, about how he used to help his mother carry groceries because she couldn't walk far. The other man listened carefully, nodding, and said, "Funny, I used to do the same thing." They both smiled. It was a small connection, but inside a place like that, it meant the world. Over the next few weeks, the warden invited a local teacher to visit the prison once a month to talk about life lessons, things like patience, choices, and change. The men looked forward to these talks more than anyone expected. Some even started keeping journals. They wrote about their days, their feelings, and their hopes for what might come after their time inside. The teacher once said, "You can't change what's behind you, but you can change the way you walk ahead." Those words stuck in their minds. They began repeating them to each other whenever someone lost patience. One evening, while the sun was setting and the sky turned orange, one of the younger inmates approached the older man who had once been part of the argument. He said, "Can I ask you something?" The older man nodded. "How did you stop being angry all the time?" The man smiled softly and replied, "I didn't stop being angry. I just stopped letting anger be in charge." The younger one thought about that for a moment. "How do you do that?" he asked. "You start by breathing," the older man said. "Then you think about what it'll cost you if you don't." Those simple words spread quietly through the blocks. People started saying them like a reminder. Breathe first. It became something like a code, a small act of self-control that changed the way people reacted. The guards noticed it too. Fights were fewer. Shouting had turned into talking. Men who used to keep to themselves were now helping each other. One of the guards, a man who had worked there for over 10 years, told the warden, "I used to think these men couldn't change. But I was wrong. They just needed someone to believe they could." The warden smiled and said, "Sometimes people just need a second chance to see themselves differently." The chaplain continued his evening sessions and more inmates began joining in. Some even volunteered to share their stories, not out of pride, but to help others understand they weren't alone. One night, an older man stood up and said, "I've done things I'm not proud of. But what I've learned here is that being sorry isn't about saying the words. It's about becoming someone who wouldn't do it again." The room went quiet. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A new inmate arrived, young, angry, and full of pride. He walked through the halls like he owned the place, bumping into others, trying to show he wasn't afraid. The others watched him quietly. The older men, the ones who had once lived that same way, didn't react with anger. Instead, one of them walked up to the young man and said, "You remind me of who I used to be, but trust me, that road only gets harder." The young man laughed at first, but later that night, he joined one of the group talks. He didn't say anything at first, just listened. But in time, he began to open up too. The cycle was slowly breaking, one person at a time. The warden saw all this happening and felt something shift inside him. For years, he had thought his job was to maintain order, to make sure the rules were followed. But now he realized his job was more than that. It was about helping men rediscover their humanity. He called a meeting with his staff and said, "We've seen what understanding can do. Let's keep building on that. Let's not go back to fear when respect works better." His words spread through the guards as well. Some of them began to change the way they spoke to the inmates, not with softness but with respect. And that respect came back to them. It was a simple exchange, but it made a world of difference. By the time a year had passed since the original argument, the story had become a quiet legend inside the prison. New inmates heard about it as soon as they arrived. People said, "This place changed because of one small fight that turned into a big lesson." It became a reminder that change doesn't need to start with big moments. It can start with something as small as two people learning to listen. The warden decided to hold an event one afternoon, something simple but meaningful. He gathered everyone in the yard and said, "I want to thank you. Not because everything is perfect, it's not, but because you've proven that people can grow even in the hardest places." He paused and looked around at the faces in front of him. A year ago, this yard was full of anger. Today, it's full of people learning from each other. That's something worth being proud of. There was no loud cheering, no big celebration, but there was silence filled with respect. Some nodded, others clapped quietly. It was enough. The two men who had once argued stood side by side, watching. They didn't say anything, but both knew how far they'd come. Later that evening, the older man wrote a note and slipped it under the warden's office door. It said, "You saw something in us we didn't see in ourselves. Thank you for giving us the chance to change." The warden found it the next morning and read it several times before tucking it into his notebook. He didn't need to know who wrote it. He already understood. As time went on, the lessons from that one argument became part of the prison's routine. Every month, the inmates gathered to talk, to share, to reflect. The warden made sure those sessions never stopped. He knew that peace wasn't permanent. It needed to be cared for, like a small flame. But he also knew that as long as they kept talking, kept listening, that flame wouldn't go out.
One night, as the lights went out and the halls grew quiet, one of the men whispered to another, "Crazy how one argument changed all of this." The other smiled and said, "Yeah, sometimes life teaches you through the mess you make." And that was the truth of it.
A simple argument that could have ended badly instead became a lesson for everyone inside those walls. A reminder that no matter how dark a place seems, there's always a way to bring light back, even if it starts with something small. In the end, the prison didn't just hold men who were serving time. It held stories of change, of forgiveness, of second chances. And while the walls still stood tall and the doors still locked at night, something inside those walls had shifted forever. It all began with one small argument, but it ended with a lesson that no one would ever forget.